Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video. Today I want to do something a little bit different and talk to you about a film that I just saw last night, which was Doctor Strange, which stars Benedict Cumberbatch as the Titular Sorcerer Supreme and Doctor Strange. You have Chiwetel Ejiofor as Karl Mordo. You have Rachel McAdams as Christina Palmer, Benedict Wong as Wong, Mads Mikkelsen as Kaecilius, and Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One. You have Scott Derrickson, who is the director, who you may recognise his name from the film Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio. You have C. Robert McAdams on the screenplay, and John Spaihts and Scott Derrickson and the C. Robert McAdams all working in conjunction on the story. So the general consensus is it follows the adventure of Dr. Stephen Strange, aka Doctor Strange, as he is represented, as he has always been in the comics initially when he started out, as a brilliant surgeon, in this case a neurosurgeon, specializing in spinal injuries and brain damage, etc. He's a brilliant guy who is absolutely brilliant at his job, but he is also incredibly arrogant. But the film doesn't actually start out that way. It actually starts out with the new to the Marvel Cinematic Universe villain of Kaecilius, who is portrayed, as I mentioned, by Mads Mikkelsen, who some of you may recognise from the Hannibal TV series, where he portrays the titular character of Hannibal Lecter. Now, Kaecilius breaks into the library of Cumberbatch, which is, I guess you could say, the training ground for the Sorcerers and the Sorcerer Supreme under the Sorcerer Supreme's tutelage, which in this case, the Ancient One is actually still the Sorcerer Supreme. So he breaks into the library and steals a page from one of the forbidden books of knowledge, which is from the Ancient One's collection, and he then proceeds to battle the Ancient One and vice versa in London on some of the beautifully represented architecture, and the film's visual effects and the the cinematography and the fight choreography and everything is just insanely beautiful, but at the same time really mind-bending and crazy. Now, if you've seen Inception, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a lot of reality bending. There's a lot of really interesting things that are done with the buildings, and the fact that buildings fold in on themselves and they raise up from their foundations and they create new platforms, and they shift and change as according to the, in this case, the sorcerer's will when they cast certain spells in order to aid them in their battles against other, in this case, evil sorcerers led by Kaecilius, who was a former pupil of the Ancient One and has since gone off to join the film's big bad, which I won't spoil who it is, but I will say it's one of Doctor Strange's long-time nemesis and long-time members of his villains gallery, or his rogues gallery. So as I said, the film follows Dr. Stephen Strange, who, in a career-ending car accident, which is pretty horrifically portrayed actually, and I sort of cringed and winced when I saw the initial car accident when he actually got caught in it, which of course severs the, as anyone who is familiar with the the history of Doctor Strange in terms of the comics, which was started out by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko back in the 1960s, a horrific car accident severs all the nerves in his hands and causes severe nerve damage, and therefore leaves Doctor Strange with a permanent handicap, and therefore stops him from ever being a surgeon ever again. And of course, he is, he's frustrated, he is devastated, and he is angry over this particular situation when he sees the damage and the extent of which they tried to repair his hands. But if anything, it just made the situation for Stephen anyway even worse. So Stephen, who is now a broken man who is desperately trying to find a cure for himself, he spends all his life savings, and then he goes into spending money that he doesn't even have in a way to basically get his hands back to where they used to be. And this eventually leads him to travel to Nepal, seeking an instant miracle cure, and is then obviously, he's beset upon by a couple of hoodlums who try to steal his watch, and then he is rescued by Karl Mordo. Now, interestingly enough, as we all know, if you've read any of the Doctor Strange series previously, you know that Mordo is also a long-time member of Doctor Strange's Rogues Gallery, but in this particular incarnation, he is actually a friend, fellow sorcerer, or eventual sorcerer,
an eventual equal and a friend to Stephen Strange, and in also in the same capacity as the Ancient One, he is also a mentor to Stephen, in terms of tutoring him on the ways of magic and the forces that they deal with in terms of the supernatural element and the supernatural entities that are forever threatening the larger scale Marvel universe. And there's some really great, humour peppered throughout the film, and there's a real great character journey for the character of Stephen Strange, going from this arrogant surgeon who has to control everything, who believes that the world centers around him, to this man who is eventually elevated and enlightened to an extent where he fully embraces his calling as a sorcerer, and he then basically moves past his anger and his grief, and he becomes a full-fledged sorcerer in his own right. Now, I have to say, the acting across the board is absolutely stellar across all of the performances, particularly, for me anyway, the most stand-up performance next to Benedict Cumberbatch himself is actually Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One, who fully embodies the equal parts friend, mentor, and teacher of the Ancient One, and you get the real sense that she's lived for hundreds of years, she's trained hundreds of sorcerers in her time, and she eventually finds Stephen Strange, and she agrees to teach him after Stephen sort of comes down of his high horse and agrees to, follow the tutelage and the teachings of the Ancient One. Now, I have to say, one aspect of the film's visual effects and the visualization that initially threw me was the actual representation of all the astral projection and the mind traveling to these far off dimensions, where it's it's extremely bright, extremely colorful, and extremely beautifully well represented. But it also in a way echoes the artwork of Steve Ditko, who, if you remember from those earlier stories, was very psychedelic and very trippy and very sort of made you think, am I actually on a drugs trip here, or am I actually reading an actual comic book? Which is an interesting nod and a wink back to the original stories by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. One of the other things that I really like is the fight scene choreography and the action scenes, which is all really, really well done, and is a mixture, largely sort of 70% magic based, but then 30% hand-to-hand combat and traditional fight scenes. And this is really personified in the fight scene between Kaecilius and Doctor Strange, when he eventually has to hold his own in the New York Sanctum in the city of New York, when Kaecilius eventually puts his larger evil plan into fruition and tries to basically bring about the arrival of his master, aka the film's big bad, which again I'm not going to spoil who it is, because obviously the film's only just come out, but it's really, really well done, and there's some really interesting and really cool representations of the two items that are signature to Doctor Strange in the form of the Cloak of Levitation and the Eye of Agamotto. Now, Agamotto is actually referenced as the most powerful Sorcerer Supreme to ever to existed, and obviously created the Eye of Agamotto. And there's a really, really interesting and a really funny scene with the Cloak of Levitation as Stephen eventually comes under attack by Kaecilius and his followers. And there's actually a really funny scene where the cloak actually detaches himself, or itself I should say, from Stephen Strange, and proceeds to basically wrap itself around one of Kaecilius' followers and basically pummels him by pulling him back and forth and just beating his head up and down on the floor, and the cloak's just really wrestling with this guy and just trying to basically keep Stephen from being killed. And again, speaking of Stephen's sort of transition from this egotistical, arrogant human being seeking to control everything to a man fully embracing his calling, there's a really personified scene where Stephen's arrogance and his frustration gets the better of him, where he yells at Christine, who is a friend, colleague, and one-time lover of Stephen Strange, over the frustration that he's had with trying to get his hands working again. And then she proceeds to leave Stephen, and he's in an even worse place than he was initially before, to a man who now fully embraces the the world of magic and the ways of magic and the realms of infinite possibilities and the reality that he's now in with becoming a sorcerer under the tutelage of the Ancient One. I will say that one thing that kind of bugs me is the frustration at the Big Bad's visualization and the visual effects of the Big Bad,
who I believe suffers from what I'd like to call the parallax effect. Now, if any of you have seen the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern film, you'll know what I'm talking about with regards to parallax and how parallax was represented. Now, parallax was meant to be this yellow creature, parasite of alien origin and this embodiment of fear, whereas Dormammu, I just let the big bad's name slip, I'm sorry. Spoilers, the big bad's real name and the big bad of the film is actually Dormammu. Now, Dormammu is meant to be this flame-headed demon lord and ruler of the dark dimension and a practitioner of dark magic, whereas in this he suffers from the parallax effect, where he's just this embodiment of energy and just this floatless head with a voice, and just doesn't look like the Dormammu that we all know and remember. If you've seen, for example, his representation in the Spider-Man animated series in the 90s, when Doctor Strange eventually guest starred in that, and Spidey eventually met both Doctor Strange, Wong, and by extension Mordo and Dormammu. So it's not the Doctor Strange that we know and love from the comics, and that sort of bugged me a little bit. But I will say that the ties to the larger Marvel Universe as a whole, which was a reference to actually the Avengers, where Wong actually tells Stephen the Avengers protect Earth from, earthbound threats and outer space threats, whereas the Sorcerers, and by extension the Sorcerer Supreme, protects the Marvel Universe and the world at large from the more supernatural threats. And there's also some really cool and interesting twists with regards to the Eye of Agamotto, and again the ties to the overarching plot of the last couple of films, from Guardians of the Galaxy all the way up to Avengers Age of Ultron, and Thor's initial quest to go off and find out who exactly has been gathering the forces at large and the seeking and the acquisition of the Infinity Stones. Now, I won't spoil the twist in the film as to what happens there, but I will say it's a great film. It's a thoroughly enjoyable film, a fantastic film. In fact, I think it's a really cool, really well representation of the character of Doctor Strange, from this arrogant human being up to the the enlightened and the sorcerer that we all know and love, as well as obviously introducing members of Doctor Strange's Rogues Gallery and introducing magic to the Marvel Universe on a grander scale than we've seen in, say, the Thor films, with Loki and his mischief and his magic. Just really introducing magic to the Marvel Universe as a whole. And in fact, we had a teaser of Doctor Strange in the larger Marvel Universe back in the scene on the rooftop with Jasper Sitwell, Sam Wilson, Natasha Romanoff and Steve Rogers, where basically Stephen Strange's name was actually dropped as one of the targets of Hydra when they eventually bring the weapons online, and they seek to basically probably wipe out half of the world's population, as Hydra perceives them as threats to Hydra's plan in the third act of the Captain America the Winter Soldier film. So, in closing, if you are a fan of Doctor Strange from the comics, if you're a fan of Benedict Cumberbatch, or if you're a fan of the Marvel Cinematic films in general, I highly, highly recommend you go and see Doctor Strange, as it is a fantastic film. It is it comes as no surprise to me, because I've always really enjoyed all of the Marvel Cinematic films, with the exception of the Iron Man films, which have just been okay, but the rest have all been fantastic, especially the Captain America films, the Avengers films, and now the Thor films and the Doctor Strange films. So yeah, it's like I said, the acting across the board and the performances is absolutely stellar. The films, trademark humour of the Marvel films is there, and it's really, really funny and really well done. There's some really interesting twists in terms of the larger plot of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films, as well as really great ties and nods and callbacks to events of previous films in terms of the overarching plots. And this is just a really fun action romp tied to the the world of magic in the realm of the Marvel Universe, and also perfectly, I believe, encompasses the origin story and the eventual transition of Stephen Strange into the Sorcerer Supreme that we all know and love. So, like I said, if you haven't seen it yet, go and see it. Hopefully this film review is up to par with my previous videos, and I hope that the non-spoiler aspect of the film all gets you all interested in going to see it. It's a really fun, action-orientated romp with magics galore, and basically, the same trademark humour and the character journeys and the character fruitions of the characters throughout the rest of the film, and it's definitely well worth seeing, in my humble opinion. Thank you everybody for watching. As always, hope you all enjoyed, and until next time, this is Skyrim896 signing off, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.